Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 428 of the All Dolphins podcast. It's the ever popular, never to be missed, very difficult to pronounce, apparently, Behind Enemy Lines weekly episode of the All Dolphins podcast. Today, it's Houston Texans edition, and to talk all things Texans and all things Dolphins versus Texans at NRG Stadium in Houston. I am joined by Cole Thompson, the managing editor of the Texans Wire. How are you, Cole?
I'm surviving. It's been a good bye week. I think everyone needed it. And now we got to go into a stretch where the Texans are going to be on a 3-game schedule within 11 days, which feels a little bit far-fetched from the NFL's perspective. But at the same time, you want to be the best, you got to beat the best. And 3 of the best teams are coming into either NRG Stadium where they're going to go play against them in Arrowhead.
Yeah, I was about to say, well, at least it's a tough stretch of 3-11, but at least it's not like they're playing good teams, right? Because after the Dolphins, it's at Kansas City and at home against Baltimore. So
yeah, just 2 teams that very well are probably going to be in the AFC Championship this year. Yeah, I mean, no problem whatsoever.
Yeah, maybe. No, and you know what? I don't have a major issue with your Baltimore prediction because their record's not great. But you look at the teams they've beaten, their strength of victory, I mean, dwarfs anybody else's. They were like at 556, the teams they've beaten, unlike a lot of teams that have fed on mediocre competition. So certainly don't sleep on the Baltimore Ravens, who are a team the Dolphins are trying to catch along with the Chargers, the Broncos, and potentially the Texans if it goes south for them and they don't win the AFC South. Because the Texans right now are 8-5, but it's kind of if there's such a thing, it's kind of an ugly 8-5, no?
Let's just say this. When we talk about the Baltimore Ravens, their record does not define how well they've played. When you talk about a 6-7 Miami Dolphins team, their record is not defined as well as they played. A 5-8 Cincinnati Bengals team does not define as well as they've played. An 8-5 Texans team does not define as well as they played in a negative connotation. They have gotten very lucky in a lot of matchups. And this is coming from somebody that caught major flack this offseason saying that this is a 10-7 team that plays in a weaker division that probably is just going to sneak on into the playoffs as a number 4 seed. And everyone was really coming down on me. Cole, you don't understand football. It's like, yeah, well, I remember last season when you saw a 4th place Jacksonville Jaguars squad go out, better their roster by adding in some free agents, bettering their roster by bringing in a up-and-coming promising wide receiver in Calvin Ridley, and they go from having a 4th-place schedule to a 1st-place schedule, and they miss the playoffs. And that was a scare for Texans fans, and so far I feel pretty confident. It's a team that right now also is missing a lot of elements defensively. Noah Azeez Al-Shaair suspended for 3 games. He try to appeal it. Ramon Foster decided to deny it even for the 2-game minimum suspension. Jalen Petrie is another big name that is in this matchup. He has been phenomenal in the nickel position this year, especially against the run. We've actually talked about this multiple times off air with people inside the building and people just around the league. This is one of those matchups where it feels like those are 2 essential pieces that you need to secure a victory. And with the victory and a Indianapolis Colts loss, Houston clinches the division. So there are massive ramifications in this game. It's going to be a chess match between 2 former Kyle Shanahan disciples.
Correct. Mike McDaniel against D'Amico Ryans. For the first time, last time the Dolphins played the Texans, it was in 2022. It was in South Florida. The Dolphins spanked him 30-15. It was ugly at the half. And then early in the 3rd quarter, I think the Texans had like 4 sacks in a 6-play stretch or something ridiculous like that. And Mike McDaniel at the time, Dolphins had a comfortable lead, was like, you know what, Tua, get out of there because you're about to get killed behind the offensive line. I think that's a concern as well in this particular game, although the Dolphins mitigate the opponent's pass rush with an awful lot of quick throws. That helps them. But the scary matchup for the Dolphin offense versus that Texans defense is Kendall Lamb at right tackle, very possibly Patrick Paul at left tackle because Teron Armstead's dealing with a knee issue, versus Will Anderson and Daniil Hunter.
Yeah, dude, you know this as well as I do. When you look at offensive line play, it needs to be consistent if you want to win a championship. And that's a major problem, I think, right now for Miami. The difference is that Miami's quarterback in Tua Tagovailoa, it's like he went under the microscope, got his brain completely resurged when he was on the IR, and now is making every single correct read as humanly possible because of a 14-1 touchdown to interception ratio since coming back from the IR. He has a 75.1 completion percentage, over 1,700 passing yards. The dude is a surgical technician when it comes to reading the field and taking his opportunities. He's not missing many throws. He's not throwing into double coverage. That's going to be something that is going to probably help Miami. But on the flip side, Houston has 2 dark horse members for the Defensive Player of the Year candidacy. Will Anderson is going to finish the year with double-digit sacks, which is a significant improvement after winning Offensive Rookie of the Year. I don't think enough people understand just how talented of a player Danielle Hunter is. Like, in his entire career, he's going to finish the season potentially with 100 career sacks, over 225 tackles for losses. He's going to finish this year probably leading the NFL in pressures and is number 2 in quarterback hits, and he's not even 30. Like, this is a specimen that could eventually turn into a future Hall of Famer if he continues this trajectory. He is leading the NFL right now in pressure rates and quarterback hits, and a young offensive tackle like Patrick Paul is going to have a field day with him. Now, on the flip side, though, you have to realize that even though Chop Robinson is the only pass rusher for Miami that has been consistent this year because of injuries, this is an offensive line that has allowed the 4th most sacks in the NFL. So it could be a game where you're watching as Chop Robinson makes his presence known, where Will Anderson continues to stockpile up stats, where you're watching Danielle Hunter end up breaking an AFC South record for the weekend, and eventually you're still going to see Miami come out on top on a game-winning field goal, or Houston come out on top on a game-winning field goal. Quarterback play is going to be really essential. I think the thing that you're really going to have to wonder in this matchup is which quarterback can make the right reads in a timely manner before the pressure decides to collapse the pocket.
Yeah, and by the way, sorry to correct you here, but Zach Sealer's been the best Dolphin pass rusher from an interior defensive line spot, which brings me to walk. Every time I watch the Texans play, like that interior offensive line is like, oh my Lord, is it bad? Like, wow, man, is it bad?
It's a what would be the best word I can put in it? It's a turnstile of misery right now at the position, whether it be from Juice Scruggs moving from center to guard, Jared Patterson playing the position. Shaq Mason, the numbers probably don't justify it because of how bad the left guard position has been. Maybe the most disappointing member of the Texans offensive line. Titus Howard has been disappointing at times this year. The only staple has been Laremy Tunsil, and let's just call a spade. You have to also take into consideration he's going to get 2 penalties a game, including 1 false start. So it comes with the good and the bad, but that interior offensive line has just been a masquerade of misery. You have to figure out what is going to be the game plan for Nick Caserio in the offseason. Every mock draft has them taking an interior offensive lineman, whether it be Tyler Booker from Alabama, whether it be like a Kelvin Banks they trade up for and they move him inside the guard. There's been conversation about maybe Blake Fisher moving inside the guard, but the interior pass rush has been so dreadful at times that CJ Stroud, as much as we want to say that the sophomore slump has been there, it's also because of the inconsistent pressure rate that he's going up against and the untimely throws he has to throw on his foot. And he's also making throws off of his front foot, not his back foot. And it probably is because if he's going to be rushed through his progression, Kenyon Green is back, which I'm not sure if that's a win. It's a win for the run blocking. I will say that, because when Kenyon Green was out there and Joe Mixon was out there, he was averaging about 105 yards per game. Now he's averaging about 88.7. But in pass pro, it's still a question mark. And the last thing that you want to do is in a game where your quarterback has to probably outduel a quarterback that is scorching red hot, and for my money, maybe has been the best quarterback in the NFL since returning from the IR. You can't afford to have your guy underneath duress for every other snap and be living in 3rd and long all week.
And this is where it plays into the Dolphins' hands, because their pass rush has come mostly. Chop Robinson got hot for like a 4-game stretch, but consistently it's been Calais Campbell and it's been Zach Sealer. So yeah. This is a good matchup for the Dolphins. You mentioned Laremy Tunsil. Obviously, Dolphin fans know him very well. 1st-round pick in 2016 after the extraordinarily famous or infamous, however you don't call it, the Bong video, fell to 13. And then the Dolphins, as GM Chris Greer told the story at the time of the trade, kept getting phone calls from the Texans, trade us Tunsil. Chris Greer kept telling him, no, not interested, kept upping the offer up to a point where Chris Greer says, okay, fine, you got me. And then he told the story of informing Tunsil of the trade and what they got in return, and Tunsil telling him, yeah, I'd have made the trade too. So it worked.
They have to build a statue. They simply have to build a statue out there for what they got in return, because of that was also the very last year before the entire rebuild had to go underway. So they got the franchise left tackle, who's very happy and has been smoking hot since joining the team. Not to mention smoking, but still he has been scorching on fire. But at the same time, they had to go through 4 years of mediocrity to finally get the quarterback right and return to national relevancy. So, I mean, yeah, when I land Jalen Waddle and I land a multiple bunch of picks too, I'm not complaining that much. I'm building a statue of 78, even though he's not part of the South Beach culture.
Except the flip side to that is, and this is I'm going to be Debbie Downer from a Dolphin standpoint here, is Dolphins still haven't won a playoff game.
Yeah.
And they solved their left tackle issue when they signed Teron Armstead in free agency because the guy's a stud, except unfortunately his body's betrayed him on a regular basis, kind of like it did in New Orleans. And now, again, as I mentioned earlier, he's a question mark for the game on Sunday. My best guess is I wouldn't count on him being out there after he left after 5 snaps against the Jets on Sunday. Do you think there's any, I mean, it's not the same regime anymore, but if you were looking at it from a whole organizational standpoint, do you think there's any buyer's remorse from the Texans about that trade?
Maybe a little, only in terms of what they could have gotten, because if they would have been a top 3 pick one year, they would have been a top 7 pick one year. They would have been able to keep one of their second round picks. So that part is really a flincher. I think the fact that they also threw Kenny Stills into the deal and he never really panned out. And it was more so just say, well, Laremy Tunsil, we're going to throw an extra guy in there because we know that you need to upgrade your wide receiver. Will Fuller was dealing with the constant injuries. As Dolphins fans know, he played 6 snaps and then was decided to retire right after he signed the 1-year deal. So they understand that this is a guy that was always dealing with problems. Yeah, DeAndre Hopkins, lo and behold, it was the very last year before DeAndre Hopkins went off to Arizona. Yeah. So you probably needed those selections simply because of you wanted to continue to build a young foundation. But Tunsil's been still one of the best left tackles in the game since he's arrived in 2019. He's always number 2 or number 1 in pass protection. He's always in the top 10 in run blocking. He's a leader in the locker room. He loves Houston. He loves the organization. I think that he's a guy that will potentially, if they can agree on the right terms, will stay the majority of his career, if not the entirety of his career, retire as one of the greats that has been a part of this offensive line. That probably was the game plan for Dwayne Brown when they decided to trade him in 2018. So it's there's a lot to say that Tunsil has been a godsend, especially for whoever has been the quarterback back there, and you don't know what you're going to get. Sometimes the buyer remorse is the asking price and the net return versus, well, we got a proven commodity. And I think that's where a lot of people look at the Tunsil deal and say, we knew that he was an elite pass protector. If we got maybe a random dude in the draft that wasn't this way, where's our team right now?
No, fair enough. It's long after the fact, but I got to mention it because you've covered the Texans for a while now. So were you surprised that Will Fuller basically, how can I put this delicately, wound up retiring very quickly after playing 4 games with the Dolphins?
You mean, am I shocked that a guy that was an injured-prone player found a way to get injured once again outside the system? No, I'm not. This was again, the thing was such a selling point that I remember just threw him throughout the draft process. And that was such a unique draft because of all the wide receivers that didn't pan out. And then you got into 5th and 6th round, and all the guys that did, they all had that one trait that really stood out. And for Fuller, it was speed. And what happens with speed is hamstrings usually find a way to snap, or your body is dealing with more of the speed caliber, so you don't have as much muscle on the bones. And then you realize you have a hip problem, and then you have a broken collarbone, and then the broken collarbone turns into a broken shoulder blade, and then the broken shoulder blade turns into a torn ACL, and then there's hamstring issues. And so it was just a laundry list of concerns to where I remember when he had his big breakout year and he was fully healthy, everyone was like, we got to re-sign him, or we at least got to put him on the franchise tag. They chose not to do either one of them. It ended up not being buyer's remorse. He was really consistent when on the field, but he was just never on the field. And so, when you look back at that draft, he's going to be one of the better first-round wide receivers in the class. But that's not really saying as much because if everyone else was a bust, he just was the most consistent when healthy. And the problem was he was never healthy.
Yeah, and there was also some scuttlebutt. I don't know if it was ever reported, but that maybe the love passion for the game wasn't necessarily on a terribly high level.
I think that from what I remember and talking to some people, it was because of the injuries. It was just, why continue to go out there when I know I'm going to get hurt? And that eventually led to him retiring. He tried to maybe make a comeback with the Cleveland Browns. It was very clear that his body was starting just to deteriorate. He's going to go down as one of the best wide receivers of the 21st century at Notre Dame. He's always going to be remembered for some of his big catches in the 15 uniform. But there was a moment where you realized this is not working out. Unfortunately, I got to do what's best for my career. The best thing for my career is to no longer play football.
Yeah, he won't go down in Dolphin lore as being a great free agent signing. In fact, actually, there are still Dolphin fans who use his name. I've used him this year when Odell Beckham Jr. took a while to get into the lineup because he had an offseason knee procedure. And as we've seen, unfortunately, Beckham's not been much of a factor. The guy who's been the great free agent acquisition for the passing game has been Jonnu Smith. The Texans running game, Joe Mixon, I guess, has been a pretty good acquisition for the Texans.
Dude, I'm not going to lie. That's been the best pickup of the entire offseason for Houston. And that's saying a lot when you have a guy in Danielle Hunter that's in the running for Defensive Player of the Year. But you knew what you had in a player in Will Anderson. You could have gone out and brought in another defensive lineman that probably would have finished with 8.5 sacks and 17 tackles for losses instead of 25 tackles for losses and 17 sacks and be okay. This has been the worst run game in the NFL since 2020. I mean, when they brought in David Johnson and they let Carlos Hyde walk in free agency, they guaranteed themselves to finish with under 800 rushing yards, average around 3.8 to 4.1 yards per attempt. They haven't had a 1,000-yard runner in 5 years. They haven't been able to utilize the ground game as a factor to open up the passing attack. And so Bobby Slowick and the team said, let's go out and get a proven commodity. They were in the running for Tony Pollard. They were in the running for Saquon Barkley. There was rumors about DeAndre Swift potentially coming on in here. And then Aaron Jones got released. And I remember just looking and saying, Kevin O'Connell comes from a very similar system of what they ran out in San Francisco. I think this could be a really good fit. I think Matt LaFleur comes from the exact same system. Green Bay, Minnesota, whatever it is, he's going to go one of those teams. They miss out on him. They go make the trade because they know he's going to be a free agent. And you got to remember, Zach Taylor comes from that same kind of coaching mentality, and it was a plug-and-play addition. And his first game, he had 159 rushing yards. He gets hurt. The rushing attack drops from 4.6 yards per play to 3.8 yards per play. They can't get anything with Dameon Pierce. They can't get anything with Cam Akers. They can't get anything with Daria Gumbawale. He comes back and he rushes for 5 consecutive 100-yard games. I mean, this is a dude that missed 3 games and really 3.5 because of the Chicago game. He wasn't in for the entire second half. And he's in the top 10 in rushing. We're not reminding ourselves that this is a guy that, if fully healthy, is probably top 4 in rushing behind 2 exceptional free agent pickups in Saquon Barkley and Derrick Henry. And he's a fraction of the price. I mean, it's a 3-year, $27 million deal with 2 years that can be opted or restructured after 2025 to where if he stays healthy at 29 years old, he's going to be 32 when his contract's up. And you could add an extra year if you want to restructure the money and keep him around. It's a security blanket for CJ Stroud to take a lot of pressure off of him. He's going to be the first running back to rush for 1,000 yards since Carlos Hyde. Remember that name? It's been a hot minute. So he's been a blessing, I think, for the style of offense that they want to run. The only question that you have is when teams are able to slow them down, then you have to trust the passing attack. And the play calling this year has been so predictable that it ends up hurting Houston than actually helping Houston to go through the air.
And you mentioned the play calling, and you mentioned his name before. It's interesting. We also have, along with the connection with Mike McDaniel and DeMeco Ryans, we have a brother versus brother matchup of Bobby Slowick, the Texans offensive coordinator, against Ryan Slowick, who is a Dolphin assistant defensive coach. So,
Bobby is an interesting guy because of partially the play calling is based off of what you have. And I think a lot of people want to just go ahead and look at last season and say, well, remember what we did last year where we were 7th in passing, we were 9th in rushing. We were 28th in rushing, but we were 3rd in third down conversions and we were 6th in red zone efficiency. And it's like, you have to realize that the offensive line is taking a step back. There's been regression all across the board. Surprisingly, when Michael Dieter left, I thought that was actually a good thing. It ended up,
former Dolphin alert.
Yep. But now so I thought that Juice Scruggs, guy who was a center, who played guard last year, going to go play center finally for the first time. They felt really good about Jared Patterson. Play calling has been awful because of pass protection has been awful. On top of that, run blocking has been awful at times. The injuries to Stefon Diggs have not helped out with the passing game. You're asking a lot more of Tank Dell and John Mechie and Xavier Hutchinson and Robert Woods, who are all 3s and 4s to now be 1s and 2s because of Nico Collins was out for 5 weeks. And so you're starting to see, I think, more of the consistency of what you wanted from Bobby Slowick in the second half of games for what is available to him. What's interesting is that, again, before last week's game against Jacksonville, they had scored 1 touchdown in the second half since week 6. I mean, that's a disaster. It's a non-winning formula. The offense and the defense, actually, the defense had more points than the offense did in the second half of games since New England. I mean, that's a recipe for anyone to lose. And people are like, how are we losing games? Because your offense can't do anything. I mean, they had 5 turnovers against the Detroit Lions. Jared Goff was a pick machine that afternoon. He could do nothing right, and they still found a way to lose. They're the first team since the 1970 Chicago Bears against the Baltimore Colts. That's how far back you gotta go. Johnny Unitas was still playing football when the last time that a team got 5 interceptions and was leading by 2 scores going into half and lost a football game. So it's a lot of things that have gone wrong for Houston this year. I think that getting back a healthy Nico Collins has really benefited CJ Stroud. Again, 2 weeks in a row, he's finishing with 90 plus receiving yards, 8 plus catches. You're starting to see John Mechie kind of step up into that slot position role. You're watching as Dalton Schultz has had a better game. So I think that this is the version of what Houston fans expected in the second half after they saw what they did at the very beginning of the year. But they're still just struggling. They're getting by with 3-point wins, 5-point wins against sub 500 teams. And if they're not winning the game, they're losing in outright fashion in heinous, sporadic moves. And like the Tennessee game is a bad one because of Kaimi Fairbairn just made history that game where he had his 12th consecutive 50-plus yard field goal. And then he misses a 28-yard chip shot. Like nothing can go right. And then the holding calls, the penalties are just so bad. Like the illegal shift on the Nico Collins 41-yard touchdowns, like just take the knife, stick it on in, and twist it even more while we're down and out of the count. Thank God they play in the AFC South.
They do, and that's the difference between them and the Kansas City Chiefs, who are always involved in close games, but no matter what, they always win it. Because I'm looking right now at their losses. They got smoked by the Vikings in week 3.
Yep.
Other than that, 2 points against Green Bay. The game against the Jets, the Thursday night, was an abomination. Detroit game, they easily should have won. The Tennessee game was just a really bad loss. I have to ask you, before we got hurt, how did the Stefon Diggs experiment look in terms, not so much in terms of what he brought on the field, but what he brought in terms of chemistry, any issues? Because he's kind of a wide receiver who, for lack of a better term, soaks up a lot of oxygen.
He may soak up a lot of oxygen, but he breathed a lot of life into Houston's locker room. It was really interesting because if I remember when we first got to meet him, and we didn't get to speak to him throughout off-season workouts, but we did a training camp, and he had multiple interviews with us. He was very down to earth, very happy, very relaxed. Every single time that they would be doing drills or there would be interviews going on, you would see him working with John Mechie on the sidelines. You would see him doing extra routes with CJ Stroud. You would see him giving advice to Tank Dell and to Nico Collins. And he was also giving advice to Kamari Laster, the rookie cornerback out of Georgia, and Derek Stingley. Hey, when a wide receiver is dropping his shoulder, it usually means he's cutting to the outside versus the inside. He was a very vocal leader inside that locker room and a big piece of what they call the leadership council. They loved him. I mean, he was voted on as a team captain, and there was a lot of expectations that not only was he content in Houston, but remember, they voided the last 3 years of his contract. So he was up for a brand new deal. They figured that there would be conversations of maybe another extension because they figured that this is a guy that fits really our culture and our blend. And maybe it's only for 2 years, but you got to remember, for about 3 years, there was a lot of positivity in Orchard Park when you had Stefon Diggs and Josh Allen working together. So maybe you don't sign that 8-year deal to where you think that they're going to be the franchise long-term guy. You got that guy, Nico Collins, but he was a really good locker room fit. The mood after he tore his ACL on a non-contact play, it was sombering. They got a win against the Colts that day. And you go into the locker room and everyone is just silent because they know that he's done. They know that the season's over and he is no longer a part of this team. And it felt like in that moment, Houston just kind of started to unrail the tracks because of whether or not you want to say he was the glue of the offense or he was the moving part of the engine. The fact is that as soon as they lost him, things went south, like almost immediately. They lost to New York the following week. They lost because they didn't have a secondary a third wide receiver, actually a secondary wide receiver in the Detroit game. The Tennessee game right afterwards was the first game back for Nico, and he had a good game, but really nobody else did. And then the Jacksonville game, the Aziz hit was the main storyline, but I thought the other storyline was they were inconsistent in the first half. And in the second half, they finally got some life where Mixon scores a touchdown and you got 2 big plays to Nico Collins. And then you have a big touchdown pass to Dalton Schultz on the 22-yarder, just wide open. Like nobody was even near him in coverage. And then here comes Mac Jones leading to come back to Parker Washington. And it's like, are we really doing this again? So Diggs was a big part of that locker room. His impact has very much been felt.
Last thing before we let you go, you kind of mentioned already a little bit, but let me go again and present it to you this way. Without necessarily making a prediction, your 30 seconds or less, your kind of general feel for how the game goes on Sunday.
I'll make a prediction. I think Miami wins. I mean, I personally do. The fact is that they don't know if they're going to have Christian Harris back at linebacker. So now you're going to trust Neville Hewitt and Henry To'oTo'o, who are both Sams.
Former Dolphin alert.
Both are Sams. They're not really Wills, so they can't play in coverage. The fact that you're going to have now a younger Caitlin Bullock play more reps and Eric Murray's going to have to play in the back end because Jimmy Ward has to play in the nickel is a little bit alarming. And as much as I do believe this offensive line is going to be more improved because they had a week off, again, you brought this up, Calais Campbell and Sealer, they're just phenomenal passers at the middle. Jordan Brooks, I think, has been flying under the radar too for an open field tackler. That's going to create opportunities to limit the run game. That's going to create more of a passing attack. If Jalen Ramsey and Javon Holland can create turnovers, you're in a really, really, really good spot. So I think this is going to be a 4-quarter battle that eventually leads in favor of Miami. Miami stays alive for another week in the playoff picture.
Okay, very nice. Guys, you heard him. Cole Thompson. If this prediction does not come, he has guaranteed a Miami Dolphins win. If the prediction does not come true, I'm going to give you his Twitter handle right now so you can direct your ire at him at Mr. Cole Thompson, managing editor for the Texans Wire. Cole Thompson, thanks you very much for joining us and sharing the insight. Thanks everyone for watching. Please like, subscribe, all that good stuff. And we will catch you guys on Wednesday. Enjoy the rest of your day.